The U.S. government has made a significant decision that has sparked concerns across the nation. The government will no longer collect data on households struggling with food insecurity for the first time in years. The decision has raised alarms about the future of food assistance programs and the potential impact on millions of families in need. The shift in policy has generated debates over the role of data in addressing food insecurity and whether this move will help or hurt those who rely on government support to survive. With a growing number of Americans relying on food assistance programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or SNAP, the loss of crucial data could lead to unintended consequences for those who are most vulnerable. Without detailed information about who is struggling with food insecurity, the allocation of resources may become less efficient and less targeted. This could result in delays in delivering much-needed aid to the communities that need it most. For years, data about food insecurity has played a central role in shaping public policy and providing insights into the needs of the population. It has guided decisions about how much funding should be allocated to food assistance programs, where food banks and shelters should be set up, and how the government can address gaps in the safety net. By removing this data collection, the U.S. government risks creating a situation where the true scope of food insecurity is hidden and policymakers have to rely on less precise methods to address the issue. This could mean that resources are distributed less effectively and that some families may go unnoticed even though they desperately need assistance. The decision to stop collecting data has raised concerns among hunger advocates. Experts argue that understanding the scale of food insecurity is critical to ensuring that adequate resources are available to fight hunger in the country. For example, without accurate data, it could become more difficult to determine how many people are falling through the cracks and failing to get the help they need. Food banks and community organizations could find themselves working with limited information, which might hinder their ability to serve those in need in the most effective way possible. Another concern is the loss of accountability. Without data, it may become more challenging to track how resources are being distributed and whether they are reaching the communities that need them the most. Transparency is crucial when it comes to government spending, especially in the context of programs designed to support vulnerable populations. Without the ability to track data effectively, there may be less scrutiny over how the funds are used or if they are being misallocated. The U.S. government's decision could also influence the way that states and local governments handle food insecurity on the ground. In some areas, food insecurity rates have been rising, and communities are already struggling to meet the increasing demand for food assistance. By removing the data collection process, the federal government is essentially making it more difficult for local leaders to plan and respond to these challenges effectively. One of the most concerning aspects of this decision is its potential impact on the most marginalized groups in society: the elderly, low-income families, people with disabilities, and communities of color have been disproportionately affected by food insecurity for years. If the government can no longer track these trends effectively, the most vulnerable populations may end up being left behind in the process. Food insecurity is not just a problem that affects individuals, it is a complex issue that affects entire communities and regions. Without accurate data on the scope of the problem, it will be much harder to develop targeted interventions that can address the root causes of hunger and poverty. There are those who argue that removing the data collection process could simplify the government's approach to tackling food insecurity. They believe that fewer data collection requirements could result in a more streamlined and less bureaucratic system that might make it easier to deliver assistance to those who need it the most. Some proponents of the change believe that instead of focusing on gathering data, the government should focus on more direct ways of helping people, such as providing direct food assistance or increasing funding for food banks and shelters. These individuals argue that relying on large-scale data collection processes is inefficient and that the government can better respond to food insecurity by cutting through the red tape and focusing on action. There is also the argument that modern technology has made data collection less essential than it once was. Digital tools such as smartphones, apps, and other platforms could potentially provide real-time information about food insecurity trends without relying on traditional government surveys. Some believe that this shift towards more decentralized methods of tracking food insecurity could create a more agile and responsive system that allows resources to be directed where they are needed most. However, critics of this approach argue that without centralized data collection, the government risks losing sight of the bigger picture. It's one thing for food banks and local organizations to collect data on their own, but without a nationwide perspective, it will be harder to determine the overall scale of the crisis. Food insecurity is a systemic issue that requires coordinated solutions across all levels of government. Without comprehensive data, it's unclear how effective these solutions will be and whether they will be able to adequately meet the needs of people across the country. One of the biggest challenges in addressing food insecurity is that the problem is constantly evolving. The causes of hunger are complex and often vary from region to region. Some families may face challenges due to low wages, others may struggle because of rising housing costs or medical expenses. Food insecurity is often linked to broader economic and social issues, and tackling hunger requires a multifaceted approach. Without proper data collection, the government may struggle to adapt to these changing conditions in real time. Policymakers rely on data to understand not only the current state of food insecurity, but also to predict trends and anticipate future needs. For example, during times of economic downturn or natural disasters, food insecurity rates often spike. Without reliable data, it becomes more difficult to predict these trends and adjust government policies and resource allocation accordingly. As the U.S. government moves forward with this decision, it's unclear how the long-term effects will play out. The true impact of stopping data collection on food insecurity will likely become more evident in the coming years as hunger advocates continue to push for better policies. It will be important to keep an eye on how this decision affects the delivery of aid and how food assistance programs are able to respond to the growing need for help in communities across the nation. In the meantime, many are questioning whether this move will ultimately hinder efforts to address food insecurity or open the door to new and more effective ways of helping those who need it. It remains to be seen whether this change will have the desired effect of reducing government bureaucracy and improving efficiency, or whether it will make it harder to tackle hunger on a national scale. One thing is certain: the conversation around food insecurity is far from over. As we continue to grapple with these complex issues, the government's decision to stop collecting data will likely remain a focal point for those who are working to improve the lives of families facing hunger across the country. While the debate continues, some are hopeful that it will lead to a rethinking of how the government addresses food insecurity in the future, perhaps by using technology more effectively or finding innovative ways to distribute resources in a more equitable manner. It is clear that this issue requires collaboration from all sectors of society, including local governments, food banks, nonprofits, and the private sector. Ultimately, the goal is to ensure that no one goes hungry, no matter where they live, and to find sustainable solutions to hunger that can last well into the future. But as the government takes this new approach, it will be crucial to monitor its impact on vulnerable populations and assess whether it is ultimately improving or hindering efforts to fight hunger in the U.S. The consequences of this decision could be far-reaching, but only time will tell if it is the right move for the millions of families struggling to make ends meet every day. As the government moves forward with this decision, many are left questioning how communities will adapt without the key data that has been used to drive policy decisions for so long. While some argue that the shift could lead to more efficient and streamlined processes, others believe that it could hinder efforts to accurately assess the needs of those most at risk. The loss of this data could lead to a situation where those who are already struggling to make ends meet might not receive the assistance they need in a timely manner. Food insecurity is not a static issue. It is constantly evolving, influenced by factors such as economic conditions, job availability, housing costs, and health crises. Without the ability to track these trends in real time, policymakers and aid organizations could find themselves reacting to situations rather than proactively addressing emerging challenges. Data collection has always served as a vital tool in predicting where hunger will spike, so removing it leaves an enormous gap in the ability to address the problem before it escalates. Another critical aspect of the debate is the potential for this decision to create a situation where solutions to food insecurity are less comprehensive and more fragmented. Different organizations and government levels may take different approaches to the problem, but without a unified national perspective, their efforts might overlap or miss the mark. This could lead to inefficient use of resources or create disparities in aid distribution, where some communities may receive too much assistance while others are left underserved. The question of fairness and equity also looms large in this debate. Food insecurity disproportionately affects vulnerable groups, including low-income families, communities of color, the elderly, and people with disabilities. These groups often face systemic barriers that make it more difficult for them to access adequate nutrition. If these groups are not adequately represented in the data, there is a risk that their needs will not be prioritized and they may be left behind in the distribution of food assistance. With the government's decision to stop gathering food insecurity data, the question arises whether those in need will still receive equitable access to support. For many, the fear is that without proper data, it will be more difficult to hold the government accountable for the actions it takes in response to food insecurity. The data has historically been used to measure the effectiveness of food assistance programs and to ensure that federal resources are being allocated efficiently. By removing this data collection, there is a concern that there will be less scrutiny over how these programs are run and whether they are reaching the intended beneficiaries. At the same time, there is a growing movement advocating for alternative ways to gather information about food insecurity. Technology offers a promising avenue for collecting data in real time through apps, surveys, and digital platforms that can give immediate insights into local needs. Proponents of this approach argue that using technology could allow for more targeted, timely responses to food insecurity rather than relying on traditional, slower methods of data collection. These tools could offer a more localized approach, helping food banks, local governments, and nonprofit organizations to quickly identify the areas most in need of support. However, critics argue that technology should complement, not replace, a comprehensive national data collection system, as it is unlikely that these decentralized efforts will paint a complete picture of food insecurity on a national scale. The government's decision has sparked an important conversation about the balance between government intervention and self-reliance. Supporters of reducing data collection argue that the government's role in providing food assistance should be less about monitoring and more about direct action, distributing resources and ensuring that food reaches those who need it without getting bogged down in data gathering. They advocate for policies that focus more on immediate relief rather than on tracking every household's food insecurity status. On the other hand, those who oppose the decision contend that reducing data collection will lead to an erosion of the government's ability to address food insecurity in an organized and effective way. They argue that data is necessary to understand not only the scope of the problem, but also the root causes that contribute to hunger. Without this information, the government may find itself unable to tackle the issue effectively, leading to wasted resources and a less targeted response. The removal of data collection also raises important questions about the future of food assistance programs. Programs like SNAP, which provide critical support to millions of low-income families, rely heavily on data to determine eligibility, resource allocation, and program effectiveness. Without reliable data on food insecurity, these programs may face difficulties in accurately assessing who needs help and how much assistance to provide. This could lead to more rigid policies that do not take into account the specific needs of different communities or the changing circumstances of individual families. Some advocates for food assistance argue that the decision to stop collecting data signals a shift in how the government views the issue of food insecurity. By removing the data collection process, there may be a shift away from addressing food insecurity as a structural issue and towards viewing it as a more individualistic problem. This could have long-term implications for the way that food insecurity is understood and treated by both policymakers and the public. As food insecurity continues to rise in the United States, it's essential to consider how these policy changes will affect the long-term sustainability of food assistance programs. Hunger is not just a problem that can be solved by handing out food. It requires a systematic, coordinated approach that includes data-driven decisions, targeted interventions, and the ability to anticipate future challenges. By eliminating data collection, the government risks losing its ability to proactively address food insecurity, leading to reactive responses that may not meet the needs of the population effectively. The removal of data collection may also hinder efforts to secure funding for food assistance programs. Data is often used to justify the need for federal and state funding, and without it, lawmakers may be less inclined to allocate money to address hunger. The absence of concrete numbers showing the extent of food insecurity could lead to reduced funding, further limiting the resources available to fight hunger. Furthermore, without data, it may become more difficult for researchers, advocates, and community organizations to track progress in addressing food insecurity. Data is crucial for measuring the impact of food assistance programs, identifying areas of improvement, and demonstrating the effectiveness of policy changes. Without this information, it will be challenging to assess whether efforts to combat hunger are successful or if more needs to be done. As the conversation around food insecurity continues, it is clear that the decision to halt data collection is just one part of a larger debate about how best to address hunger in the U.S. The implications of this decision will likely unfold over the coming years, with its impact felt by both the families who rely on food assistance and the organizations that work tirelessly to combat hunger. Whether or not this move will improve or hinder efforts to address food insecurity remains to be seen, but it is a decision that will undoubtedly shape the future of food assistance in the country. As the debate continues, it is crucial to focus on finding solutions that prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable populations while ensuring that food assistance programs remain effective, transparent, and accountable. Only time will tell whether this shift will ultimately help or harm the fight against hunger in America.